been a long time since the last Bass Players Book Club episode, my apologies for that. I've had quite a few requests for recommendations on theory books, so let's get into that. This is actually going to be a two-part affair. Part 1 is going to deal with what you actually need to know. Part 2 is going to cover some of the resources that I think are useful in getting there. Music theory tends to be a source of confusion for a lot of people, but it's really important in your everyday life, and it seems to be almost universally badly taught in schools. Now, music theory is a huge topic, so I'll do my best to only deal with the relevant information and cover everything in the shortest time possible. Now, I just said that music theory is important to your everyday musical life, but just how important is it, and where should it really be on your priority list as a musician? Here's a question that I often find useful to ask myself if ever I feel like I'm getting too bogged down in theoretical things. Have you ever been to a theory concert? Exactly. The music is what matters. The playing comes first. Music theory always happens after the fact. It's a way of explaining why certain things sound good and why others don't. It's a means of communicating these ideas to yourself and to other musicians. But is it the most important thing? I don't think so. It's our musical equivalent of spelling and grammar, and as such it's a fairly dull, dry and dreadful thing on its own. If you think about learning a language, is it possible to speak that language well if you don't know any spelling and grammar? Yeah, of course it is. Is it much easier to become fluent in that language if you understand the rules that govern the language and maybe you can read and write it a little bit? I think so. Is it going to make you any worse at that language if you start to understand how it's constructed? I don't think so, up to a point. There's a massive difference between knowing about grammar and being able to communicate effectively. And when you're learning a foreign language, it's very easy to get bogged down in things like genders, cases, tenses, conjugating verbs, that sort of thing, when actually what matters is that you can go into a restaurant, understand a menu, and avoid accidentally ordering raw horse meat for dinner when you're on holiday. Now, bass players are stereotypically lacking in harmonic knowledge, which is why we're the butt of so many jokes. Broadly speaking, we fall into two categories. The first one is facility without knowledge. This means that you can play the instrument pretty well, but you lack any sort of understanding or labeling for what you're playing or why it works. The other side of the coin is knowledge without facility. This means that you understand a lot of different concepts on an academic level, but you lack the practical skills to apply them on your instrument in real time. The first condition is more common with beginners, the second one with more experienced players. Both are pretty debilitating. And actually, I think that knowledge without facility is far more crippling, because there's a huge gulf in terms of the number of hours required to understand something from the page and then to get it to the point where it's in your ears and under your fingers. There's a world of difference between understanding something on a theoretical level and being able to apply it in the real world. So how much theory do you actually need to know? Well, it depends on your musical goals, and the problem that I have in preaching to YouTube is that I can't be specific. I don't know what your musical background is, I haven't heard you play, and I don't know what you're aiming for. So in order for this video to have any merit whatsoever, we have to work out what we all have in common as bass players. And if you think about it, once you strip away things like technique, tone, genre, and taste, then what you're left with are two responsibilities that absolutely everyone has, regardless of the music they play. And those things are knowing what notes go into chords and scales, but I would say that chords are far more important, and knowing where those notes are all over your fretboard, and that's regardless of how many strings or frets happen to be on your bass and how that bass is tuned. Those seem like two fairly simple things, but actually they're both long-term projects requiring hundreds of hours of work. And it's amazing how many players are deficient in at least one of those areas. So there's a lot of information out there to work through. Where do you begin and what order do you proceed in? Let's try and put things in some sort of logical progression. Now, a lot of what follows might seem to be unbearably patronising, but as I said, I don't know my audience intimately, so it's best not to assume anything. And even some bass veterans have gaps in their knowledge when it comes to the fundamentals of music. Another thing I should point out is that these areas are by no means discrete. You don't have to complete one before starting on the other. Some of them will have to happen side by side. Step 1, part 1, deals with rhythm. Being able to identify, categorize, and communicate different rhythms effectively will mark you out as being a well-rounded musician. And yet, there are tons of players out there operating with a weak sense of time and only the vaguest understanding of rhythmic combinations. Those that restrict themselves to tab are most acutely affected because tab absolves you of any rhythmic responsibility whatsoever. You need to have a solid understanding, both on an intellectual and a practical level, of how we can divide up a bar according to whether there's one note in the bar up to 16 notes. Obviously, the smaller divisions of time are available, but those are not the priority. So you need to understand whole notes, half notes, dotted notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, 16th notes, triplets for some of those as well. You also need to have a firm understanding of all the rhythmic possibilities of 8th and 16th notes and their associated rests that occur within a single beat of music. That's our rhythmic alphabet. In addition to that, once you've dealt with 4/4, you need to develop a good understanding of other time signatures that occur regularly. Lots of musicians don't really understand time signatures, which is fairly worrying. If you think about situations like a 6/8 ballad, a waltz, a 12/8 shuffle, occasions where you have swung 16th notes but straight 8th notes, all of those are very specific musical situations, and they will have a different effect on how you play and how you subdivide the time. One final observation on rhythm: if you can't clap something, then you're really going to struggle to play it with any sort of understanding or fluency. Step 1, part 2, concerns pitch. Top of the list has to be learning the names and locations of all the available pitches all over your instrument. Again, that's regardless of how many strings or frets it has and how those strings happen to be tuned. You need to know the possibilities because this is the start of your musical universe. So, there are 7 natural notes, 4 of which have enharmonic alternative spellings. There are also 5 accidentals, each of which have 2 possible names. That gives us 21 different pitches in total. Now, pedants usually pipe up at this point and ask about or mention double sharps and double flats. Yes, they exist, but dealing with all of those possibilities as well is too obsessive even for me, so we'll leave them alone for the moment. Once you've worked out where all of those notes are on your bass, and a single string is probably the best way to go about that in the early stages, because once you get into more than one string, you start to get into finger patterns which can be restrictive if you happen to depend on them. Once you're happy with one note at a time, you need to get to grips with what happens when you have 2 notes. This brings us on to step 2, which is intervals, which are the universal building blocks of music. In my experience, most of the problems that people have with theory and harmony stem from a lack of understanding on the fundamentals of intervals. If you think about it, if you don't understand how 2 notes relate to each other, it's very difficult to understand triad, 3-note chords, and then from there, it's almost impossible to get a firm grasp on 7th chords and 9th, 11th, 13th, anything above that. Similarly, if you don't understand basic intervals, scales and modes become really confusing. How can you understand something like the Lydian dominant scale if you don't know what a sharp 11 is in the first place? So, the importance of intervals cannot be overstated. One of my teachers at music college, 1,000 years ago when I did my degree, used to say that trying to operate as a musician without knowing about intervals is like trying to be a surgeon and refusing to learn about bones. So you need to know intervals in 3 ways. Number 1, how they sound. That's the most important thing. Number 2, how they fit on your instrument. Number 3, how they're spelled. Intervals are named according to their size in semitones and the number of scale degrees between the 2 notes. You need to be fluent in intervals up to an octave in every key in order to survive as a bassist. And for some of these intervals, there might be more than one way of playing them, depending if they fall on a single string, on adjacent strings, or on non-adjacent strings. Once you're familiar with intervals up to a 5th, it's time to start working on triads. And again, people get upset about 7th chords and extended harmony because they haven't put enough work in on triads. So a very important area to know a lot about. What work do you need to do on triads? Well, we need to look at the possibilities. And to start with, there are 5 types of triad: major, minor, diminished, augmented, and suspended. The first 3 of those, major, minor, and diminished, occur naturally if you harmonize a major scale in thirds. So they're the most important. The augmented triads appear naturally in melodic minor, harmonic minor, and the whole tone scale, among other situations. And suspended triads are a really common harmonic device used in tons of contemporary music, so they're worth knowing about. Now, the way to attack these, I think, is to start by memorizing the spellings of 15 major triads. It's major triads in all keys, including the enharmonic possibilities. Once you've got those together, then you can view all the other triads as alterations of those. If you know your major triads really well, it's very easy to work out minors because you just flatten the third, or flatten the third and fifth to get a diminished chord, etc. That, I think, is far easier than attempting to memorize 75 or more triads in one hit. When you're learning the triads on your instrument, learn them on a single string, learn them on 2 strings, learn them on 3 strings, learn them on 4 or more strings in multiple octaves in as many ways as you can. You need at least 2 practical fingerings for these. You need one starting on this half of the hand from the first or second finger, and you need another one, an alternative fingering, starting from the third or the fourth finger, so you don't back yourself into a corner when you're playing, particularly if you're improvising. You need decent ways to get around the instrument, starting from either half of the hand, depending on where you are on the fretboard. Once you've got the hang of playing regular triads, it's worth looking into how to play triads in inversions. First inversion with the third in the bass, second inversion with the fifth in the bass. Learn how to voice all your triads as chords and their inversions as chords, both in closed position, all the voices next to each other, and in spread voicings, which will get you into some more melodic territory. That's a whole lot of work already, and we haven't even touched on scales. Now, to say that learning the major scale is a pretty important thing to do is a gross understatement, but there's a huge gulf, as I've said before, in just knowing a scale academically and actually being able to play it. So, once you know the DNA of the scale, its component intervals, you need to apply it all over the instrument in as many ways as humanly possible. Now, if you put in the work on note locations and on intervals, this shouldn't really be that stressful. So, once again, learn it on a single string, learn it on 2 strings, learn it on 3 strings, learn it on 4 strings. If you have more than 4 strings, then get the hang of it on that in multiple octaves. And again, work out how to start it on different fingers and in different places on the fretboard. Memorize the spellings of all 15 major scales. That will be helpful, I promise. Once you've got the hang of playing the major scale over the bass, I actually think the most important thing about the major scale is understanding the harmony that comes from it. So, if we take a major scale and we build 3-note chords in thirds from every scale degree, we get the following system of chords. And once again, this applies in every key. You need to learn it in every key. So we have 3 major chords, 3 minor chords, and 1 diminished chord. Now, understanding this is the first step towards getting to grips with what is termed functional harmony, understanding chord progressions, how they're formed, how chords like to move, how chords tend to move. And this system is really the basis of the bulk of all popular music for the last 60 or so years. So once again, it's a pretty fundamental thing to get to grips with. And if it's something that's not comfortable for you, then learning a lot of tunes, memorizing a lot of tunes, and then being able to transpose those tunes, which are skills that you definitely need to become an effective gigging bassist, particularly if you want to work with a lot of different bands, doing those things, memorizing tunes and transposing them, becomes very, very difficult. It becomes much harder than it needs to be if you don't have a framework to work from. Now, seventh chords can be dealt with using the same process outlined for triads. They're really, in a sense, just a triad with 1 additional note added, but because we've got 4 notes to deal with, there are a greater number of options than when we were dealing with 3-note chords. So here are the majority of the options available to us. These are not all of the options, but these are the most common varieties of 7th chords available. If we look at the list, the first 4 arise naturally from harmonizing a diatonic major scale. Others come from minor scales. The last one, the suspended dominant, the dominant 7th sus4, is a really common device employed by composers in all sorts of genres when they want tension, but a dominant 7th chord is too jazzy or too bluesy, so it's a useful scenario to know about. As with triads, you need to know all of these in root position and in their inversions, and I would recommend learning how to voice them as chords in as many different ways as possible. You also need to know how they fit together, how they work in terms of functional harmony and common progressions that you might encounter. Last but not least, on our voyage through music theory are modes. Now, I would say that modes are, without doubt, the most universally misunderstood aspect of contemporary music theory. And they're misunderstood for a number of reasons. The first, as I've said before, is a lack of understanding of intervals, both on a scalar basis, the actual intervals that go into the mode, and on a chordal basis about the types of chords that modes work over. And these problems are compounded by the fact that teachers and instructional methods often present modes in a misleading way. So modes are a displaced scale, an inverted scale, if you like. Most commonly it gets presented in books and other things as the C major scale, the most vanilla of all musical scenarios. The C major scale, but played from D to D, which gives us the D Dorian mode. And we're told that that's important because it's the basis for things like So What by Miles Davis, a landmark in jazz history, modal jazz. And then we're shown that, as if by magic, we can play over a 2-5-1 progression in C, D minor 7, G7, C, just using the C major scale, because it's D Dorian, G Mixolydian, and C Ionian. Magic, instant jazz. All you have to do is noodle up and down a C major scale. Brilliant, what could be better? But that's not really the case. And the way that modes are presented, I think, leads to vague, noodly playing by almost everyone that encounters them. This is why I prefer learning about chords rather than learning about scales and modes. So you really need to understand the modes in two different ways. Derivative thinking, which is how the mode is derived, where it comes from. So that's that classic, here's a C major scale. If you play it from D to D, you get the D Dorian mode. E to E is E Phrygian, etc. We learn which major scale is used to produce the mode. Useful. What's more useful, I think, in the early days, and actually on a practical level, is learning what we call parallel thinking, which is understanding the component intervals of each mode, its unique sort of tonal and sonic characteristics, and most importantly, the chord type over which it functions. Because in the real world, what you're going to encounter is another musician saying, oh, it's sort of an A Dorian thing. And you need to know immediately that that means you're playing over an A minor 7 chord, and that scale has a minor third and a major sixth and a minor seventh. All those associations need to happen instantly so you don't screw it up and play a bunch of wrong notes. So how do you begin to work on parallel modal thinking? Well, my advice would be to work on the modes based on the chord types that they function over. So if we take the 4 chord types that appear naturally in the major scale, we have a number of options for each chord type. So major 7 chords, we have 2 options. We have the Ionian mode, which is just the major scale. You don't really need to work on that because you've done your homework on it, haven't you? Other option for major 7 chords, far more interesting, I think, the Lydian mode. Major scale with a sharp 4 or sharp 11, major 7, sharp 11 is the diatonic chord that you get for that mode. Minor 7 chords, you have 3 options. You have the Aeolian mode, which is just the natural minor scale, pretty boring. You have the Dorian mode, and you have the Phrygian mode, a little bit more esoteric, but very useful if you're in a metal band and want to write something that sounds a little bit ethnic. Anyway, dominant chords, you have the Mixolydian mode, and over half diminished chords, you have the Locrian mode. So, being familiar with the sounds of those modes over those chord types and the component intervals that give each mode its characteristic sound is the most important thing, I would say. Now, it's important to point out that modes are not just restricted to the dark arts of jazz. So if you start to glaze over at the sound of modes and think that you can get away with not learning about them because you're not a jazzer, then I've got some bad news for you. Modes are used as the basis for lots of compositions in all sorts of other genres, so you need to know about them, unfortunately. So congratulations, if you've made it to the end of this video, you deserve some sort of medal or probably a stiff drink. Anyway, check out part 2 for my recommendations on the books that I used to improve my knowledge of harmony and theory.